Fine. So another wonderfully interesting topic to be engaged with today. So a very warm welcome, as I say. I'm going to hand over the bulk of the session tonight to David Herman. But let me just begin by, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Insiders Outsiders project, and I do see some unfamiliar names, to just say a few words about that. It was an idea that I had way back, actually. I can't believe, David, it's already, was it no, it can't be 7 years. Anyway, I think it was at the very end of 2017. I just had this germ of an idea about Hampstead, in fact, as a tremendously interesting and rich site of cultural interchange in the 1930s as regards the experience of the refugees. And it grew from that to something much more ambitious, namely a year-long nationwide arts festival, straddling all the arts in the whole country and many different topics and venues, big and small, which we do have a record of on the Insiders Outsiders Festival website, if you're interested in finding out more about that. And then, of course, COVID hit, and looking back, how lucky it was that it hit, if it had to hit, that it hit when it did. And the obvious thing was to do what nearly everybody else ended up doing, namely to go online. As many of you will know, we've been organising an ongoing programme of online events, most of which have been recorded ever since then, on all manner of topics pertaining to the overarching theme of Insiders Outsiders, namely the tremendously rich and varied and pervasive contribution of refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture. And of course, the topic today very much fits the bill there. So I will just say a few words about David, who I've known for many a long year for quite personal reasons, but I will mention, well, actually, not just that our kids were friends way back in the day, but also because, as some of you will know, David's wonderful father was Joseph Herman, the Polish-born Jewish painter, wonderful man who I was terribly fond of in his later years. I had the pleasure of knowing him. David, as many of you will know, is a much respected writer and critic, had worked for radio and television in previous years. The connection with Insiders Outsiders is actually very intimate, because for some years now he's been one of the trustees of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation, and much valued, a great support and source of interesting ideas indeed, such as this one, today's event. So without further ado, David, I will hand over to you just to say, everybody, you know the ropes, obviously you do, but if you'd like to comment or ask questions, perhaps write them in the chat in the first instance, and David and I will be keeping a beady eye on what pops up there. Good. Over to you, David. I'm going to make myself invisible, and thank you for being in charge.
Thank you so much, Monica. Pleasure to be with you all tonight, and a great pleasure to introduce John Idenau, who for over 25 years, John presented daily and weekly news and current affairs programs for the World Service, as well as public affairs programs and many documentaries, domestic and foreign, for Radio 4. John's first book, co-written with David Edmonds, was Wittgenstein's Poker, the brilliant story of a famous argument between two great philosophers, published in 2001. They followed this with Bobby Fischer Goes to War, an account of the famous chess match in Reykjavik, and Rousseau's Dog, a tale of two philosophers. I won't say which two philosophers, although you can guess one of them from the title, I guess. His latest book, John's latest book, is Esther Simpson, the true story of her mission to save scholars from Hitler's persecution, which is a brilliantly told biography of Esther Simpson, who played a crucial role in rescuing numerous Jewish academics and scientists from Nazism. And many of them became famous figures. I'll be talking to John for about 45 minutes, and then we'll throw the floor open to questions from you for about 15 minutes, and should be finishing around 7 or 7:05. John, may I start with, you quote Peter Gay, the great American historian, German-born American historian: "The exiles that Hitler made were the greatest collection of transplanted intellect, talent, and scholarship the world has ever seen," which is a fantastic quotation. And I wonder what role you feel Esther Simpson played in this transplantation, if you like.
Well, she was credited with a major role in that. But just to step back, her role in saving mainly Jewish German speaking academics was carried out first through from 1933 by the Academic Assistance Council, which transformed itself into the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning in 1936. And it's her role as assistant secretary there, which is the opening to any account of how she saved the cream of German academics. So we take ourselves back to the start of her work there at the Academic Assistance Council in July 1933. And her achievement is commonly summed up by saying that she helped to escape persecution 16 future Nobel Prize winners, 18 future Knights of the Realm, 74 future Fellows of the Royal Society, 34 Fellows of the British Academy. And that is just to name a few. The accolade, which was repeated in a different form by Sir Walter Adams, who became the first secretary of the Academic Assistance Council later, that she had, I'm not quoting it directly, saved the culture of the world by her work there. So that is the big picture, as it were.
And yet you suggest quite early on in the book that she's not as well known as she should be, despite having played this extraordinary role in rescuing so many figures who became so prominent. Why is that?
Well, she's commonly said, yes, to be unsung. When I was writing the book, it occurred to me that it's a feature of writing about heroines that they should be unsung. But she was very far from unsung. She had 2 honorary doctorates, 2 French decorations for her work in the field of education. She had an Austrian decoration for her work in saving Austrian academics. And what one might think of as the ultimate accolade, building at Leeds University, the business school, has been named after her, the Esther Simpson building. So she may be, in the wider sense, unknown, but she is certainly not unsung. And her life was also, her life as the savior of academics, I'm sure we'll come to, displaced by Hitler, was also recorded in a very detailed book by Ray Cooper, Refugee Academics, Conversations with Tess Simpson. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that she remained relatively unknown, yes.
And just before we came on air, so to speak, you said something very striking. You said that when you set out to write this book, you thought it would be a pretty straightforward book to write. And then as you got underway, it became more complicated in your mind. How so?
It became more complex, yes. You start off with Esther Simpson, Assistant Secretary from July 1933 of the Academic Assistance Council, which was conceived and set up by Sir William Beveridge, and was supported by the cream of British academics at the time. And in the course of the next years up to the start of the Second World War, she was hard at work in a role of what I thought of as the desk savior of academics, German academics, Austrian academics, Czech academics. The desk savior in the sense that Adorno called Eichmann a desk murderer. And I thought we could see Esther Simpson as a desk savior. No knife between her teeth and Sten gun in her hand as she steered her boat to rescue them from some French beach, but from her desk. And that seemed pretty straightforward. We had the list, the Nobel Prize winners, the Fellows of the Royal Society. But then to take a step back, and this is just those years between 1933 and say, if you like, to the end of the war, 1945. But in fact, she remained at or closely involved with the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning until her final retirement. She had at least 2 retirements. Prima donnas had nothing on her. In 1978. And between, in that period, the work went on to rescue displaced academics, except it went on a global basis. Her career tracked the horrors of the post-war world and the post-colonial world. And that was never mentioned. And she, in her account of her work in Refugee Scholars, never touches on it. And I thought this said something, but what was it that it said? And so it became more complex to think about her and to look into her background and how her outlook was shaped.
But starting with the German-speaking academics, scientists, and so on that she helped rescue and find homes for and find work for, how many people are we talking about?
The figures are in hundreds, not thousands. But by the end of the Second World War, the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning had precisely 2,541 academics on its books. But if we look at the period between the coming to power of Hitler and the start of the World War, we're talking in terms of hundreds, not thousands. 600 maybe in the United Kingdom, another 600 for whom places have been found or have found places in the United States. So compared with the numbers of actual refugees, the numbers are not great, but we're also looking at the elite of German academics.
And they covered a wide range of disciplines and subjects.
Yes, and introduced new subjects to Britain, such as art history. But we tend to think principally of the scientists who came over. But in fact, there were philologists, historians, experts in private international law, and so on and so forth. So the whole range of academia.
And can you give us a sense of how famous the most famous were? What sort of household names are we talking about?
Well, the household names, the Nobel laureates, I just happen to have a list. The Nobel laureates included Hans Bethe, Max Born, Max Perutz, Ernst Chain, Max Delbruck, Sir Bernard Katz, Sir Hans Krebs. Those are just some of them, of the Nobel Prize winners.
And you quote Sybil Oldfield quite early on. You say, They arrived in Britain rejected, nearly destitute, traumatized by humiliation and hatred with apparently no prospects. She, Esther Simpson, greeted them with warmth, sympathy, a highly cultured intelligence, and immense practical help. So she not only, the immense practical help was obviously important, but so I imagine was the warmth and empathy as well.
Well, this is what stands out, and this is what is celebrated about her. So that when in 1966 she had her first retirement, the scholars had a whip round to try to raise enough so that she could buy somewhere to live. Because up to that point, she had subsisted on a secretary's salary, and had moved from rented rooms to rented rooms. And they wanted her to have somewhere of her own. And in the appeal that they sent out, they wrote, "What we remember best is that she was always there, that her life centered around one problem only, how to help all of us." And others wrote that if whenever they had a problem or knew someone had a problem, they could always go to Esther Simpson to get it sorted. So, and this was it. When she was born, the good fairies gave her three gifts. One was the gift of intellect. One was the gift of music. She was a very talented violinist, and music played an enormous part in her life. And the third was the gift of friendship. And that gift she put at the disposal of people who had been uprooted, displaced, forced to emigrate, to start again. And if one thinks about it, that there they were, secure in their positions at established, world-famous German universities, and suddenly it's all over. And no, people are not talking to them. They've been displaced, dismissed, sacked. They will not get another academic job in Germany. With the help of the Academic Assistance Council, the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, they can use it, as it were, a sort of labor exchange, academic labor exchange, really, to immigrate and to find another academic post. Think of the upheaval. Think of the shock to the system. Think of the despair. Victor Klemperer, in his diaries, notes one of his academic colleagues in Dresden has been displaced, and he's gone home and he has no idea what he is going to do next or what he's going to live on. And the Lord Beveridge's creation, the Academic Assistance Council, or the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, is there to help. It's not the only institution available to help. And there is Esther Simpson with her gift of friendship to look after, to help, to offer all those things that are not simply directly practical. And they remembered it, and they were eternally grateful to her for what she did. And so reflected in that letter.
Going back to the beginning of her life, John, she wasn't born Esther Simpson.
No. She was born Esther Sinovitch, and she was the daughter of Russian Jewish emigres from Latvia, from Dvinsk, now has a different and quite unpronounceable name, so something like Pils. And her parents, Ilya, who became Ellis, and Sora Lieber, who became Sarah, immigrated as part of a considerable emigration from Dvinsk to Leeds. Why Leeds? Dvinsk was famous for its tailoring and indeed for its Hasidism. There's a story that a tailoring emigre from Dvinsk arrived to Harwich and only knew one word of English, and the word was Leeds. Anyway, she was the daughter of, as I say, Ellis, Ilya, and Sora Lieber, Sarah, and was born in Leeds, in the area of Leeds, no, Little London, but it should, I'm sorry, it should really have been known as Little Russia because of the numbers of emigres that lived there. And her father was a tailor's machinist. And she was one of a family of Isaac, the eldest, Joseph. They both went off to Canada while still in their teens to their mother's family there. Then there was Israel, who went on to become a teacher, and Esther. And they lived in what can only be described as a slum dwelling, a back-to-back in Little London in Leeds.
And she stays in England until the early 1930s. Well, she starts spending a lot of time in Central Europe. What took her to Central Europe?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and one which reaches further than first sight. Start with Esther Sinovitch's opportunities. She was intellectually obviously gifted, and she was very, very fortunate, as indeed elder brother Israel, in what Leeds had to offer by way of education for the children of the immigrant families, living a life of Yiddishkeit at home, and Esther recorded English at school. She went to a very, very understanding and helpful I suppose you call it an elementary school in those days, elementary school, and then to a very good girls' school, and then on to Leeds University. I suspect at some point then Leeds University. In the book, I think I've nailed when. She rejected, I think, obviously there's nothing direct on this, but I think it's a fair assumption that there at Leeds University, which she had played a very active life, she rejected her parents' Judaism. And she records that if you were a woman graduate, you were offered two possibilities for a career. One was teaching, and the other was a secretary. She tried teaching and hated it, but decided to educate herself as a secretary. And she, at first, was offered the opportunity not to go abroad as a secretary, but as a sort of nanny to a German family in Breslau, which is now Wrocław. It didn't go well there. But she didn't run home. She moved on to Paris and took a job with a company that built road building machines. And then found a place with the most interesting personality, Eleanor Bethel, the daughter of a viscount, who was also the Paris representative of the British Labour Party. And Eleanor Bethel had a magazine called The Greenleaf, and Esther became her assistant on that.
And then later she makes two very interesting decisions. One is that not only does she reject her parents' Judaism, she becomes a Quaker.
Well, that then comes up, yes, but note she's staying at home. She's staying abroad, rather. I'm sorry, she's staying abroad. As each job comes to an end, she does not return home. So that she goes from Breslau in Germany to Paris. From Paris, she goes to Vienna. And from Vienna, she goes to Geneva. And it's from Geneva that she returns to London under very interesting circumstances to become a secretary with the Academic Assistance Council.
And before she joins the AAC, she becomes a Quaker.
And in Vienna, she's working for the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. And they have very close relations with the Quaker Center in Vienna, which is a big, thriving center, outreach, as it were, of American Quakers. And it is there that she is attracted to becoming a Quaker and takes the first step to becoming a Quaker, yes.
And the second big change she makes is that she anglicizes her name to Simpson.
That, in the way these things happen, people writing about her have noted that when she got back to England, to London, to work for the Academic Assistance Council, one of the things she did after a month or two was to change her name to Simpson. Oh ho, people say. That's because she didn't want to, she was worried about the situation in Germany and wanted to change it. Her brothers had already changed their names to Simpson. Her two Canadian brothers had changed their name to Simpson, and her immediately elder brother, Israel, had already changed his name to Simpson. So she was following in the family footsteps.
But it wasn't because of encounters with anti-Semitism or anything else.
She had an encounter with anti-Semitism, which she records in the book Refugee Scholars, when she was working in Geneva for the International Federation of YMCAs. And there was an incident at a morning service which was held in their offices, which she found disturbing. One can put some weight on that, but I think that the position is actually different, that she had turned her back on her parents' orthodoxy. I think that what went wrong in Breslau in Germany in that first appointment was that she was staying with a conservative Jewish German family, and I think that was probably difficult for her. But she never turned her back completely, or anything like completely, on her Jewishness. And I think that in the culture, the Jewish culture of Vienna and of the academics with whom she had contact when they came over here, she found a link back to her own Jewishness.
And then in 1933 comes perhaps the most important of these turning points in her life. And can you explain a little about that?
And if you could identify which of the turning points you have in mind.
But I suppose Hitler coming to power would be one, and then the AAC would be the other.
Well, Hitler coming to power, but not just coming to power. One of his first measures on day 67 of his time in power, he passes the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. And this contains a number of provisions to exclude people from the bureaucrats from the German civil service. Being a communist or not being a supporter of the new regime is one of them, and of course being Jewish is another. So the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, April the 7th, 1933, coming into full effect on April the 11th. And it results in the not necessarily immediate, but considerably so, sacking or displacement, early retirement of Jewish academics, because, of course, academics are civil servants.
Yes.
And that is a turning point, will be the big turning point in Esther's life, yes. At the time, of course, she is working in Geneva for the International Association of YMCAs.
But then she's approached by the newly founded Academic Assistance Council in 1933, and that becomes her life's work.
Approached is not quite the word I would use. It's not altogether clear why or how Esther, working apparently happily and well regarded by her new employers in Geneva, even hears about the Academic Assistance Council. But hear about it she does, and hearing about it, this is far from clear, involves her contact with the Hungarian genius Leo Szilard, who appears in her office recommended by a friend from Vienna and asks her to type some letters for him. And he wants to set up an international university for displaced German academics. It doesn't come to anything, but he's pursuing the idea and writing to people about it. And it appears that he and Esther get on pretty well. They have lunch together and they have dinner together. And he then goes off to London. Esther decides that she wants to go to London to work for this new organization, the Academic Assistance Council. In London is a very great friend of hers and supporter of hers, he and his wife, Donald Grant, with whom she has worked in Vienna for the International Fellowship for Reconciliation. And she asks Donald Grant to go to the Academic Assistance Council and see if she can work there. And Donald Grant does his stuff. he not only goes there, he talks to the management, as it were, and he tells them that Esther is this wonderful secretary and she wants to come and work there, and he even sends the now famous telegram offering her the job of secretary in the AAC in London.
And when you describe her as a secretary, what exactly is her job description? What exactly, and indeed, what does she end up then doing?
She is a secretary, and a secretary she remained. I mean, if I can fish it out, of the book, in Refugee Scholars, the introduction to the book, Refugee Scholars, is written by the then chairman or president of the Society for the Preservation of Science and Learning. Sir Eric Ashby, a very distinguished biologist and former vice chancellor of Cambridge University, and he writes about Esther at the beginning of Refugee Scholars. Allow me, if you will, to read it. He writes in the book, Refugee Scholars, "The Society's enviable reputation is due to the personality of a woman who was recruited at the age of 30 in 1933 as assistant secretary. She was a superb secretary, managing the massive pile of paperwork without fuss, undismayed by frequent crises, and with a dogged determination to resolve them, dismissive about overwork. Well, he writes, there are other secretaries like that." Tess's rare gift was an immediate and evident empathy towards each individual refugee. In their desperate plight, she was often their first contact with British officialdom. To those that were qualified, the Society was able to offer reassurance and financial help, but Tess offered them more than this. It was, so to speak, an invitation into an extended family, for she has been able, with total sincerity, to extend her gift of friendship to include hundreds of those who came to her for help. She became so dedicated to the work that she became possessed by it.
So, John, how many applications would you say that the AAC are receiving every day during this period?
Well, she says that they were receiving so many that they had to work till 10 o'clock at night when they were in Burlington House and the gates were closed at 10. I'm not altogether convinced about that because the then director, Sir Walter Adams, wrote separately that the gates closed at 5. But the letters piled up. Now, everybody who wrote wasn't going to get helped because they were looking for, and Esther was particularly firm and determined about this, not the elite, but the elite of the elite. It was written in a letter announcing the formation of the Academic Assistant Council was published in the Times in May of 1933, and it said explicitly that they were aiming to help academics of exceptional ability, exceptionally trained. Now, what that meant was that they were going to look for quite a narrow band of people, not too young, not to have started their careers properly, and not too old, so that they were ready over the hill, but in that age band where they still had something to offer and were of exceptional ability, exceptionally trained. And those were the people who would get a positive response from the Academic Assistance Council and later the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning.
And were there also links with American universities? So if the AAC couldn't help particular scientists, academics, that they could perhaps liaise with American universities to see if they had openings.
It was a very particular sort of liaising, because the American system for helping displaced academics was quite different. But what they could do was to try to arrange lecture tours or uh, short visits by their academics to American universities, particularly non-Ivy League universities, and in the hope that that will produce an offer.
But it must have been in some ways a very heartbreaking process, because she must have suspected that if the AAC turned these people down and she couldn't find refuge for them in America, then the consequences could be disastrous.
I wish I could say that that there is evidence of empathy reaching out to them in those circumstances. I don't say she didn't feel it. There simply is nothing to show she did. And the letters that were sent to people whom the AAC or the SPSL were not going to help were pretty straightforward.
And do you know the consequences for some of those who were turned down?
Well, there were other opportunities. There was a homegrown German association, the Emergency Help for German Academics Abroad, which did very, very good work. It produced a sort of register of academics looking for work abroad, which was a directory which was paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. And they did come to work and had a desk in the SPSL's office. Esther doesn't have much to say about them. But then Esther's account is very short on recognition of what other people were doing, to put it mildly. So you've just got a letter saying, unfortunately, we're not in a position to help you, or by all means fill in these forms and we'll see what we can do. But it had to be straightforward. I suppose she would have said it had to be straightforward in that way.
Moving forward to the war in 1940, internment was a particularly important chapter in her time there.
It was her finest moment, I think. If I had to pick a moment, because you see, what we tend to do, and it's almost irresistible, is to concentrate in terms of her career on the pre-war period. But it's very important never to forget that the bulk of her career was post-war, of course. One should bear that in mind, I think, when one was come the war. The flow of refugees, of course, stops. The AAC, the SPSL rather, have moved to Cambridge. It never had a permanent home, because I think that the council members didn't expect it to go on and on and on. So it always perched in various other people's offices. At the beginning of the war, it moved to Cambridge.
And who funds it, John? Is it funded by the government? Is it funded by donors?
No, it held appeals. It had an appeal secretary, as it were, and it held appeals, and appeals was successful enough for it to raise enough to pay allowances to the academics who it had invited over, enabled to come over to Britain, extra money if you brought your family with you. But it raised enough, it raised quite a lot of money, particularly before the war. And then at a given point, the government started subsidizing as well. So the resources were quite substantial and were invested to produce income. So it was able to offer its academics the wherewithal to survive while they looked for a job, for a post.
What do you think motivated her, John? Was it her Jewish background? Was it her newfound Quaker identity?
She was a very active Quaker, particularly after the war, when she came back to London. She was a very active Quaker. She was a member of the Hampstead meeting, so-called, and held two very important posts in that meeting. She was a so-called overseer and a so-called elder, and is remembered still by people for her interest and participation and the work she did there. No, I don't believe that it was her Quaker stance. Certainly, I think that there was a substantial connection with her Jewishness.
What kind of connection would you say?
I think that though she may have rejected her parents' orthodoxy, that she was how can one put this, had a high Jewish consciousness, I think. And certainly the contact with the mainly, but not exclusively, German-speaking Jewish academics, I think had the what it meant to her had some relevance, had some hold there.
There's a fascinating moment in the book when you quote her saying, "The people who were losing their jobs were the same sort as those I had played chamber music with in Vienna."
I also question that. I think, not to put too fine a point on it, what took her to London was Leo Szilard. And but then once she got there, she became personally, I think at a very human level, involved in the fate of these unfortunate, uprooted, displaced academics. And I think part of that was a rediscovery of her Jewishness.
And how do you think she'll be remembered, John?
Well, she will be remembered as the person who saved all those Nobel Prize winners. But there will be others who remember her, how very musical she was, and her commitment to chamber music. There will be people who remember her from something we haven't touched on, and that is that after the war ended, she left the SPSL and went to work for over 20 years for the Society for Visiting Scientists, which was a learned society British Council government institution to welcome visiting scientists to Britain and to London, to give them somewhere to stay, somewhere to have contacts with other scientists. It was very enlightened and successful. Visiting scientists could stay there, they could lunch there, they could go to meetings there, they could meet other scientists there. It could serve as a temporary headquarters for them on their visits. It was designed to help re-establish European science after the Second World War, and of course with the benefits that would bring to Britain. And she was the secretary there, though somebody we haven't mentioned, A.V. Hill, in a document described her as the hostess. But she worked there from 1944 to 1966. So that was a very substantial part of her life.
Well, I can see there's a number of questions from our audience. So let me just somebody asks, apart from the brief time in Breslau, did she visit Germany at all?
The answer is no. Not in that period when she had, I think, 5 jobs in 4 countries over 8 years. She did not visit Germany. You know, she went from Germany to Paris. There's no record of her visiting Germany, but of course she spent and thoroughly enjoyed Vienna. And indeed, once she got back to Britain and was working in London, she went back to Vienna every summer with her violin and her viola up to 1937.
And Emily Fuggle asked, did she and the AAC provide much support to women scholars in particular?
Well, that's a very, very pertinent question. And the answer is there was a separate organization emerged for women university scholars. And the AAC dealt with some. I make a point in the book that when he was writing his account of the AAC and the SPSL, Beveridge was always very careful to note that it was a woman physicist or a woman chemist, but only a handful, and a separate organization emerged for women academics, which really did the job, had its own secretary.
Catherine Whitaker mentions her grandmother, Dr. Elisa Baumgartel, who was an archaeologist and Egyptologist. I don't know if you've come across her in particular.
No, I'm ashamed, regret to say, no, I'm sorry. That the name didn't ring an immediate bell, I'm sorry.
And Emily also asked, I wondered who else was on the board or governance of the AAC, and whether she had particularly good working relationships with individuals there that facilitated her work, besides Szilard, she adds in brackets.
The AAC SPSL had a council, an executive committee, and an allocations committee. Esther, in the book Refugee Scholars, makes a little passing comment at being surprised that they were all very eminent academics, British academics. She notes her surprise that they were so good at administration. But they did a very, very good job, and particularly the allocation committee met frequently and regularly, and all through the war as well. But the name that stands out, which we haven't mentioned, is of course A.V. Hill, Archibald Vivian Hill. An outstanding figure and a supporter of Esther, particularly at the time of internment. But he held every post in the SPS, so he was responsible for its change of name. He was a Nobel Prize winner, Nobel Prize in 1922. He went on a very important government mission to the United States about shared scientific research towards the war. And he became an independent member of parliament for the university seat of Cambridge. And he's continued to do important scientific work into his late 50s and 60s. And he was really in constant contact with Esther, a supporter of Esther, and looked to something, I think, to her future, because in 1944, it was A.V. Hill who persuaded her, I think is the right word, to leave the SPSL, which was likely to come to an end, the end of the war, and go to the Society for Visiting Scientists. So his name particularly stands out of the contact she had with the council, the executive committee, the allocations committee.
And Joe Oliver asks, would it be fair to say she didn't think much about Hitler or fascism or German politics before 1933? And do we have any evidence she anticipated the dangers before Hitler came to power?
No, I think the straight answer is no. And
even though she was in Vienna?
Even though she was in Vienna, and she was going to the university. She had a ticket for the university, which was frequently closed because of Austrian Nazi activity, boycotting Jewish academics at the university. She never mentions anything like that. She was people-led. One of her colleagues said to me, she was people-led, not issue-led. And from the resources available to know about her, which I haven't mentioned, it's perfectly plain that she was not interested in the great issues of the day. And it still strikes me as slightly surprising that not in refugee scholars, but in other sources we have, there's no mention of the Holocaust. Eichmann goes on trial. There's no mention of the Holocaust or any interest in that. Now, what do I mean?
Why do you think that is, John?
If I had a clear answer, I think she was. The answer is that it was her contacts with people that were important to her, and particularly the displaced academics, which we haven't mentioned this. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. The one I've not neglected to mention, the one outstanding feature that everybody puts a finger on, the way in which she referred to her academics from Germany, displaced academics from Germany, as her children. She was, of course, she didn't marry, she had no children. She had a ward who she treated very much as a daughter, but she referred to these eminent cream of cream academics as her children and as her family. And no matter the range of academics on a global basis that she dealt with after the war and up to her eventual retirement in 1978, it was only those academics from Germany who were her children that she appeared to care about at a personal level.
John, we have time for one more message from Charles Franklin. It says, very interesting. Tess was a close family friend through my father's quartet playing, often visited her flat in Belsize Park.
Yes, yes, the flat bought with the money raised by her children so that she would have somewhere of her own to live. And in Buckland Crescent, Belsize Park.
Just off the Finchley Strasse.
Well, just off the Finchley Strasse, and not all that far from what was then, when she bought it and before, known as the German Synagogue in Belsize Square.
John, I'm afraid we're out of time. I would just like to thank you all for joining us this evening, and my special thanks, of course, to John Idenow for such a fascinating conversation about his wonderful biography of Tess Simpson, which I cannot recommend too highly. It's a wonderful read. Monica, I don't know if you had any other
Yes, I would love to just
Please.
sort of chip in if I may, and I can't resist asking Charles Franklin, without wanting Charles to put you in the spot in any way, whether you'd like to conclude the proceedings by just giving some personal reminiscences of Esther, just to bring her further to life. No pressure at all, but if you could, that would be wonderful.
Well, thank you all very much for listening to me and for your very interesting questions. And thank you, of course, David. And I must apologize for leaving Esther's children to the very end. When
Well, I can't help feeling there's much more that could be said on the question of gender, but I'm going to bite my tongue, and obviously we don't want to go over time. But let me just end, if I may. Obviously, thanks, John, above all to you, but David, as ever, for being a wonderful interviewer. But could I just mention, I mean, I have to say, just on a very personal, but also, sort of professional note, that every time we have an event like this, I find the connections, the cross-referencing to other topics covered in the course of the Insiders Outsiders program absolutely fascinating. So I'd like to just start, well, actually, one thing we haven't mentioned, which is important, not specifically to do with Insiders Outsiders, but this wonderful sense of continuity. CARA still exists, the Council for At-Risk Academics. Yes, we should have mentioned this also, John, I think you'll agree. Still exists to this very day.
Agree.
I mean, what a wonderful link between 1933 and the present.
We should have mentioned, I absolutely agree. Yes, the SPSL lives on in the Council for At-Risk Academics.
Absolutely. And on that topic, just looking forward, actually, first of all, rather than back, I was telling John before we started properly that actually in the pipeline is an online, well, maybe actually an in-person or hybrid conference on this broad, rich theme, which is so pertinent to today's session, namely the experience and the reception of the emigrant academics and their contribution to British academic life. And I'm going to be working on that in association with the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, which is part of the University of London. It's in the future, but keep an eye out for that. But just thinking of things we've covered in the past programme, the Quakers, it seems to me fascinating. I mean, perhaps, John, dare I say it, you maybe downplayed the significance of her Quaker beliefs. Clearly, her Jewishness was a complicated affair. Completely agree that the failure to engage with the horrors of the Holocaust is surprising, isn't it? It remains a puzzling thing. But the Quakers have a fantastic record of helping refugees. And indeed, there were quite a few Jewish refugees I've come across who actually did convert, if that's the word, to Quakerism in later life. So I think there's something there. And indeed, we have at least one event. If you go to the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, which I hope you will indeed spend some time browsing in, there's at least one event that took place some while ago about the Quakers and indeed their help through many, many decades, not just in the 1930s, but particularly in the 1930s to those in need who needed to come as refugees to this country and indeed elsewhere. Internment was mentioned very, very briefly. What a rich, morally murky, but sort of intellectually and creatively sort of interesting subject that is. And we have, in fact, a whole subsection on the YouTube channel on issues to do with internment and creativity in internment in particular. So do check that out. And just actually one small but I think significant thing, I organised recently an online conference on the fact that Dartington Hall in Devon was, I think, well, still too little known, but really significant place of sanctuary for many creative refugees from Nazi Europe. Not so much the academics, but more the artists and the musicians and so on. But there's one particular connection there. There's a lovely elderly lady now called Gabrielle Foti, who actually took part in the panel discussion that was the concluding event of our conference. It's on the YouTube channel again, there is the recording. And her father became a language teacher at Dartington because guess what? I think it was either he or her mother who were playing chamber music with Esther Simpson, and she opened the doors to Dartington. So there you are. All right, lovely. I think enough for one evening, John. Thank you so much. What an interesting subject. And thank you all for being here. The recording will be up on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel fairly soon, in the next week or so. So please feel free to spread the word about that. And I hope to see some of you at least in future events. Thank you very much and good night. And David, thank you so much as ever.
Pleasure as always.
Good
Thank
night.
you.